This is the story of a woman who saved thousands of lives but lies awake every night, punishing herself for the one she couldn't do. She's a doctor. She knows the science of sleep. She understands that insomnia is a medical condition with physiological roots, but knowledge doesn't heal guilt. Sometimes only forgiveness can. Her name is Dr. Sarah Chen, and she's been awake for 12 years. Not continuously, she's not insane, but in the only way that matters, she hasn't truly slept since the night a patient died because of her mistake. This is a story about the hidden cost of refusing to forgive yourself, and about what becomes possible when you finally do. Sarah lay in bed at 3 a.m. staring at the ceiling of her apartment. The red digits of the digital clock glowed in the darkness. 3:14. In 46 minutes, the alarm would go off. She would shower, dress, drink coffee, and go to the hospital where she would be impeccable, focused, present, excellent. But first, she would spend these 46 minutes lying here, replaying the worst night of her life, the one detail that had replayed 10,000 times in 10,000 separate nights over 12 years. The clock had been showing 11:47 p.m. when she told the nurse to administer the medication. 11:47. She remembered this with crystalline precision because it was the last moment before everything changed. The medication was appropriate given her initial assessment. The dosage was correct. The procedure was sound, but her initial assessment was wrong. She had been on her 36th consecutive hour of work. Her mind was clouded by exhaustion. She missed something critical in the patient's presentation. A small detail, easily overlooked by a fresh doctor, but the kind of detail that separates life from death in emergency medicine. Sarah knew she should take a sleeping pill. As a physician, she understood the science. Sleep deprivation impairs cognitive function, damages the immune system, increases risk of depression, anxiety, cardiovascular disease. She knew all this. She had published papers on it. She taught residents about it, and she refused to take medication to address it in herself. This was her penance. This was how she paid for what happened. Lying awake became her form of self-flagellation, a nightly reminder that she wasn't worthy of the peace that sleep would bring. If Linda Chen could no longer sleep because she was dead, then Sarah Chen shouldn't sleep either. The logic was flawed, but it felt true. Dr. Sarah Chen was, by any external measure, a stunning success. At 44 years old, she was a renowned cardiologist with an impeccable publication record, a leading researcher in her field, a mentor to dozens of younger doctors. Her reputation was immaculate. Colleagues sought her consultation on difficult cases, medical journals published her findings, patients requested her specifically. The hospital considered her one of their greatest assets. But the woman they described in meetings and conferences existed only during business hours. The real Sarah lived in the space between 3 a.m. and 4 a.m., the hour when the guilt was most acute, when the consequences of her exhaustion felt most present, most real, most deserved. She had perfected the art of appearing functional. Her apartment was sterile, impersonal, more like a hotel room than a home. No photographs, no decorations, nothing that suggested anyone actually lived here. No relationships, no social life, no close friends. She went to work and she came home and she lay in bed and she repeated the cycle. It was efficient. It was safe. It was utterly, completely lonely. But loneliness was another part of the punishment she'd chosen. She didn't deserve connection. She didn't deserve joy. She didn't deserve the companionship of people who cared about her. These were luxuries reserved for people who hadn't killed someone. The patient's name had been Linda Chen. No relation, which Sarah had found particularly cruel. A random coincidence that she was also Chinese, also had the same last name, which meant the name echoed every time Sarah thought about what happened. Linda Chen was 68 years old, admitted to the emergency department with chest pain. She had a history of diabetes, hypertension, and gastric issues. The chest pain could have been cardiac, but it could also have been gastric distress given her history. Sarah, exhausted beyond the point of safe functioning, made a rapid assessment. She focused on the diabetes and hypertension factors, but missed something that the autopsy would later reveal. Linda had a rare cardiac presentation that mimicked gastric symptoms. It was the kind of thing that could fool a fresh doctor. It was the kind of thing that should have tripped a careful examination. It was exactly the kind of thing that exhausted doctors missed. Sarah had prescribed medication that would have helped with gastric distress, but that did not address what was actually happening. Linda's condition deteriorated. Hours later, she coded. By the time they got her to the ICU, it was too late. Linda Chen died of a cardiac event that Sarah's mistake had cost her time to address. There was no lawsuit. The family didn't pursue any legal action. If anything, their grace made it worse. They understood. They knew emergency medicine was complicated. They accepted that mistakes happened. They didn't blame Sarah. Everyone except Sarah understood that Sarah wasn't a murderer. Everyone except Sarah could forgive her for being human. So Sarah had decided to punish herself instead. She'd become obsessed with preventing it from ever happening again, threw herself into work with manic intensity, used guilt as fuel to become the best doctor possible. Her perfectionism was born directly from that single moment of failure, and it had produced extraordinary results. Patients lived because of her meticulous attention to detail, her refusal to cut corners, her absolute commitment to excellence. She saved hundreds of lives, but she did it from a place of self-punishment, not purpose. She did it as payment for a debt she believed she owed. She did it every single day, and every single night she lay awake and remembered that no amount of excellence could undo what she'd done. Sarah's colleagues noticed she never married, never dated, never had close friendships. They assumed it was because she was married to her work. It was more accurate to say she was married to her guilt. The work was just the mechanism through which she channeled her punishment. She was a high-functioning martyr, and nobody could see the crown of thorns she wore because it was invisible. 12 years of this, 12 years of 3 a.m. conversations with herself, replaying and replaying and replaying. 12 years of appearing excellent while feeling broken. 12 years of refusing to let herself live because one person couldn't. The irony was so complete, it was almost comic. Sarah, who preached the importance of sleep to her patients and colleagues, hadn't truly slept in 12 years. Sarah, who understood the physiology of guilt and trauma, subjected herself to both nightly. Sarah, who saved lives through medicine, was slowly destroying her own life through self-punishment. Then came the medical conference, the prestigious one where top cardiologists presented their latest research. Sarah was chosen to give a keynote address. She flew to the conference city, checked into the hotel, prepared her presentation on the latest advances in cardiac care. She delivered her speech flawlessly, her expertise on full display, her research compelling. The audience applauded. Colleagues congratulated her. For 2 hours, she was celebrated as one of the best in her field. And then she excused herself to the bathroom and stood there, shaking, terrified, unable to breathe, staring at her reflection in the mirror. This was what she always did after public presentations. She looked at herself in the mirror and asked, "How are you still pretending? How is no one seeing through you? How do you keep getting away with this?" That evening, Sarah was in the hotel bar alone, trying to process the disconnect between how everyone saw her and how she saw herself. A woman in her 50s approached her carefully. Professional appearance, warm but measured. "Dr. Chen, I'm not sure if you remember me. I'm Margaret. My mother was, she was your patient 12 years ago." Sarah's world stopped. She recognized the name immediately. Margaret. The daughter of the woman she'd killed. The family that had been kind about it, that hadn't sued, that had accepted it as tragedy. And here was Margaret, approaching her at a bar, which could only mean one thing. She was here to confront her, to finally express the anger her family had contained, to make Sarah face what she'd done. Sarah prepared for it. She'd been preparing for 12 years. She opened her mouth to apologize, to accept whatever rage Margaret had brought. Instead, Margaret said something completely unexpected. "I'm not here to hurt you. I actually came to this conference hoping I might see you. I noticed something during your presentation. You looked like you were drowning. And I recognized that look because my mother had it. She looked exactly like that before she died. I wanted to tell you something, and I'm not sure how to say it, so I'm just going to say it. I think you need to hear that my family never blamed you." Sarah couldn't process the words. They didn't make sense. Margaret continued. "My mother was sick, Dr. Chen, very sick. She'd been declining for years. The hospital visit where she died wasn't a surprise to any of us. We knew it was coming. It was sad, yes, devastated, absolutely. But we weren't angry. We understood that medicine is complex, that mistakes happen, that her body was failing regardless. We let it go. We grieved and we moved forward." "You should hate me," Sarah heard herself say. The words came out broken, desperate. Margaret looked at her with an intensity that felt unbearable. "We should, maybe. But we don't. What I'm wondering is why you hate you so much." They sat down at a quiet table. Margaret bought them both water and told Sarah about her mother. Not the version that lived in Sarah's nightmares. The patient who died because of an exhausted doctor is mistake. The version that lived in Margaret's memories. Linda, Sarah's mother. Linda, who was warm and funny and kind, who loved gardening and terrible jokes, and her family fiercely. Linda, who had been sick for years before she died. Linda, who would absolutely not want her death to be destroying someone else's life. "My mother left journals," Margaret explained. "After she died, I read them. I wanted to understand what she was thinking in her final years, and one thing that struck me: she would have been horrified to know that her death was poisoning someone else's existence. She would have wanted you to be okay. She would have wanted you to forgive yourself." Sarah wanted to argue, wanted to explain that no, Margaret didn't understand. This was more serious than Margaret was acknowledging. But Margaret cut her off gently. "I've spent the last 12 years living, Dr. Chen. I got married. I had kids. I became a teacher. I built a good life. I honored my mother by living fully, not by suffering. And I think that's what she would have wanted from you too." Something inside Sarah cracked. Margaret's forgiveness was somehow worse than anger would have been. Anger she could fight, could justify, could use as fuel. Forgiveness forced her to confront what she'd been doing. Not honoring Linda's memory, but destroying her own life in ways Linda would have hated. Margaret's compassion was like a mirror Sarah couldn't look away from. "You're a woman who made a mistake," Margaret said, "and has spent 12 years becoming an excellent doctor because of it. Do you see that? You've probably saved hundreds of lives trying to prevent what happened to my mother. That's not nothing. That's not evil. That's dedication. Yes, it started from a bad place, from guilt and punishment, but look at what it's created. Look at the good that's come from it." Sarah asked the question she'd been afraid to ask for 12 years. "What would your mother want me to do?" Margaret didn't hesitate. "Live. Forgive yourself. Sleep at night. Build a life that matters. That's what my mother would want. They exchanged contact information. Over the following weeks, Margaret called Sarah regularly. She told her stories about Linda, real stories, not the sanitized version in Sarah's guilt. She told her about Linda's sense of humor, her wisdom, her grace. My mother would recognize herself in your guilt, Dr. Chen. But she wouldn't recognize herself in your self-punishment. She was too kind for that. Too wise. She understood that we're all doing the best we can with the resources we have. She would have forgiven you immediately if you'd asked. And she would have wanted you to forgive yourself. For the first time in 12 years, Sarah began to consider that forgiveness might not be betrayal, that continuing to punish herself wasn't honor, that refusing to sleep, refusing to be happy, refusing to move on might actually be disrespecting Linda's memory. The woman Linda had been would have wanted Sarah to heal. The version of Linda that lived in Sarah's nightmares, the victim, the tragedy, would have wanted that too. One night, Sarah stood before the mirror in her bathroom. She'd trained herself to avoid this for years, unable to look at herself without seeing the doctor who killed a patient. But Margaret's voice was in her head now. Look at what it's created. Look at the good that's come from it. Sarah looked at her reflection. Exhausted, yes, but not evil. Haunted, yes, but not a monster. A woman who had made a mistake and had spent a dozen years trying to prevent it from happening to anyone else. A woman who was suffering because she couldn't forgive herself, not because forgiveness was wrong. That night, Sarah took a sleeping pill for the first time in 12 years. She lay down, not with dread, but with intention, fell asleep without replaying the accident, without the ritual of guilt. And when she woke the next morning, she made an appointment with a therapist, not to punish herself through reliving trauma, but to actually process and release it, to understand why she'd been so determined to carry this alone. The insomnia began to fade. Her body, finally given permission to rest, gradually accepted that permission. She slept 5 hours, then 6, then a full 8. She started noticing colors again, noticing the taste of food, noticing the world beyond the narrow tunnel of her guilt. Colleagues commented that she seemed lighter somehow, though she was working just as hard. She was, but she was working from a place of purpose now instead of punishment. Sarah reached out to Margaret with an idea. I want to establish a cardiac care fund in your mother's name. Not as penance, as legacy. Your mother's death taught me something important about medicine and about myself. I'd like to make sure that lesson helps others. Margaret wept when Sarah told her this. My mother would love that. She'd think you finally understood. Sarah began mentoring younger doctors differently. Instead of pushing them to perfection through fear, she taught them to strive for excellence through purpose. She told them about Linda. I made a mistake that cost someone's life. It took me 12 years to forgive myself. I don't want that for any of you. Learn from your mistakes, grow from them, but don't let them define you. Your worst moment doesn't have to be your only moment. The younger doctors responded to her differently. They still respected her skill, but they also connected with her humanity. She wasn't a brilliant but terrifying mentor anymore. She was a woman who had suffered and survived, who understood their fears, who wanted them to succeed without destroying themselves in the process. Sarah continued therapy for 2 years. She processed the guilt, examined the punishment, confronted the identity she'd built around being the bad doctor. And gradually, she reframed her story. Instead of, I'm a cardiologist who killed a patient through negligence, she began to say, I'm a doctor who made a mistake that taught me something important and motivated me to become exceptional at preventing such mistakes. Both were true, but one destroyed and one built. She chose the one that built. A year after meeting Margaret at the conference, Sarah gave another keynote speech, but this time it was different. She told Linda's story openly. She explained her mistake, her punishment, her refusal to forgive herself. "I used guilt as fuel for excellence," she told the audience. "For 12 years, I worked from a place of self-punishment, not purpose. And yes, I became an excellent doctor. But I paid a price for it. I paid with my sleep, my peace, my ability to live a full life. I paid with 12 years of isolation and self-hatred. This year," she continued, "I learned something that changed everything. The person I'd hurt most wasn't the patient I'd lost. It was myself. And the person who could forgive me most easily was the family of the patient I'd lost. They forgave me long ago. It took me 12 years to hear it, believe it, accept it. If you've made mistakes, if you're punishing yourself, if you look in the mirror and see only failure, I'm here to tell you something. Your worst moment does not have to be your only moment. You can learn from your mistakes without being defined by them. You can grow without destroying yourself in the process. And sometimes the forgiveness you need to hear will come from the person you least expected to offer it." The audience sat in stunned silence. This was not the confident expert delivering the latest research. This was a woman, vulnerable and honest, speaking from hard-won wisdom. Margaret's family eventually invited Sarah to family gatherings. At first, she was uncomfortable. "How can you include me after what I did?" Margaret simply said, "Because my mother's forgiveness was real and because you deserve it." Over time, Sarah became part of their circle. She wasn't replacing Linda, no one could do that. But she was building genuine human connection for the first time in 12 years. She was learning to receive love and forgiveness without immediately rejecting it. Sarah wrote a letter to Linda, something she'd never done. She didn't mail it. The letter wasn't meant to be read, it was meant to be written, to be a bridge between the guilt and the forgiveness. "Dear Linda, I'm sorry for the mistake that cost you your life. I'm sorry I spent 12 years punishing myself instead of honoring your memory. Your daughter helped me understand something. You wouldn't have wanted that for me. You would have wanted me to live, to grow, to forgive myself. So I'm doing that now. I'm forgiving myself. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life being the kind of doctor and person you would have been proud of." Thank you for teaching me that. Rest well. Sarah burned the letter and watched the words turn to ash. Not an act of forgetting, but an act of release. She was letting Linda go, not as a memory, but as a source of self-punishment. Linda would always be part of her story, but she didn't have to be the only story anymore. Now, when Sarah woke at 3 a.m., she didn't immediately begin replaying. She breathed. She acknowledged the thought when it came, and then she let it pass. She had learned that remembering wasn't the same as suffering. She could honor what happened without destroying herself. She could carry the lesson without carrying the guilt. Years later, a young resident came to Sarah with a confession. The resident had made a mistake that had cost a patient their life. Sarah recognized herself completely. She sat with the resident and told her story, not to minimize the resident's experience, but to show that survival was possible, that forgiveness was possible, that a life built after such a tragedy could be meaningful. "The mistake you made will always be part of your story," Sarah told her. "But it doesn't have to be the whole story. You get to write what comes next, and what comes next can be extraordinary if you let it." The resident asked Sarah how long it took to stop feeling guilty. Sarah was honest. "I'm not sure you ever completely stop, but you stop letting the guilt be the only thing you feel. You learn to hold it alongside other things: purpose, growth, compassion, grace. And eventually, you realize the guilt has transformed into something else, a commitment to excellence born not from self-punishment but from purpose. She looks in mirrors now, not to judge or to punish, but to see. She sees a woman who made a mistake and spent a dozen years becoming one of the finest doctors in her field. She sees someone who suffered but who transformed that suffering into skill that saves lives. She sees forgiveness written across her face in the form of sleep, peace, and the ability to smile genuinely when her colleagues congratulate her. What are you punishing yourself for? What mistake from your past are you still replaying at 3 a.m.? What version of guilt are you wearing as if it's payment for being human? The person you're hurting most is yourself. And the person who could forgive you might be standing right in front of you if you'd only let them. So here's the real question. When regret haunts your nights, will you continue to feed it? Or will you finally forgive yourself and discover that sleep, peace, and genuine living are waiting on the other side? The mirror is waiting. And when you look at it with compassion instead of judgment, you might finally see what everyone else has been trying to tell you. You're not the worst mistake you ever made. You're everything you've become because of it. And that's extraordinary.